Welcome back to Unpacking Ideas, and thanks for joining if you're new here. Today we're going to be unpacking the book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life by Erving Goffman. Helping me unpack this book was Jason Doe. Jason plays many parts, as Goffman would say. He's an attorney, a yogi, a surfer, a former sociology major, and a longtime reader of Goffman. In our conversation today, we covered a lot of ground. We talked about Goffman's dramaturgical framework, i.e. using the theater as a metaphor to examine everyday interactions. We talked about the audience-performer dynamic, failed performances, working consensus, the importance of first impressions. We explored some of Goffman's terms like idealization, mystification, audience segregation, front stage, backstage, teams, and discrepant roles. And then finally, towards the end of our conversation, we looked at the existential and intrapersonal components of Goffman's work, including themes like the self as a social construct, our belief or disbelief in our own performances, and the dilemma of maintaining consistent performances over time. I don't think it's a stretch to say that I've probably thought about these ideas every day since I first read this book about 6 months ago. It's really just one of those books where you can't help but kind of think about yourself and reflect upon your own social interactions. So I really hope the same is true for you. I hope this conversation gets your gears turning. And now here it is, my conversation with Jason on the presentation of self in everyday life. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for having me. It's been a while in the making. So.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I feel like started talking about doing a podcast probably over a year ago, and then maybe about 6 months ago landed on Goffman.
Yeah, I want to say you may even asked me as a possibility, like when we met 2 years ago.
We
were doing the book as part of the philosophy meetup, the book by Alan Watts, and by the end of it, you were like, "Hey, it'd be great to come, to do a podcast."
That's true. Yeah, that actually was almost 2 years ago.
Yeah, we jumped around a lot on ideas.
We did, but I think this is the perfect one because a different guest I had recommended this book to me, and then I mentioned it to you, and you were like, "Oh, like this is the book that made me want to become a sociology major," and I was like, well, we should definitely do it then.
Yeah, I was a little bit of a blast from the past when I saw you pulled it out. It was at the end of one of your other meetups, and you had pulled out a couple of different books as a possibility of trying to figure out with the group what you wanted to do next. And I saw the book, and I was immediately sort of brought back to my 18-year-old self when I was in college, not quite sure what I wanted to do. I started taking a sociology class, and read Goffman, read the presentation of self in everyday life, and was really blown away by the ideas, and it sort of captured something at the time that I feel like only maybe more recently I was finally able to kind of realize what it was hitting at, but it certainly took me down the path of wanting to become a sociology major. And it was a little ironic because once I did become a sociology major, I felt like the focus was much more on larger societal structures and issues. It was only towards sort of the end of my studies when I was a senior that I did what I think is more what Goffman really is, which is sort of social psychology and focus on, small group interactions. And that was, I did a social psychology class, and I worked for a professor and did some help in his lab, and that was really more resonant. So
Got it. Yeah, I'm curious, like impressions reading it then versus reading it now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think at the time I took away maybe a stronger existential position from Goffman. And, reading his book now, we'll obviously get into it, but it's interesting that he only really hits upon that in the last couple pages.
Literally in like the last 3 pages.
The last 3 pages, he kind of gets to that. Look, I think Goffman can be a little bit of a tough read for people, in part because he writes from a very clinical perspective. I think, and we'll get into a little bit about the context and which he wrote this, but I think that, at the time, sociology was sort of a burgeoning field, and I think there was a strong desire to want to legitimize it. And maybe Goffman himself, or maybe a larger critique with respect to the people he was working with, was making it seem more clinical than maybe it needed to be.
Okay, right.
And that can be a lot of sort of the examples and going into very specific details about what he was seeing. I think at times can make your eyes glaze over a little bit, but there's certainly a lot of nuggets in this book that are really worth reading into if you can kind of get through that. So
for sure, yeah, the writing is definitely very clinical, but yeah, the ideas are just so interesting, so profound.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we could talk just a little bit about like the historical context in which Goffman was writing. So this book came out in 1956, I believe.
Yeah.
And I think it was following his research in Scotland.
Yeah, he had done some research in the Shetland Islands at a hotel, I think like late 1940s, early 1950s. And so was sort of observing like hotel workers and staff and the patrons there, and sort of based a lot of, this book, I believe, on sort of that experience.
Right. A lot of his examples are from that kind of like what are called crofters, like working class.
Yeah.
I guess farmers, I guess would be similar.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously that's, I think, helpful context to put into for anyone listening because, 1950s, Scotland is going to be very different from other sort of cultures, and the things that he might be opining on in terms of, saying, well, this is how things work, are obviously very specific to the time period and very specific to the group of people that he was looking at. So
for sure. Yeah. I mean, he talks a little bit about like cultural context towards the end of the book. And it seems like his kind of takeaway is that a lot of his framework still applies cross-culturally. It's just maybe some of the particulars are going to be different. So we'll get into some of these different terms like front stage, backstage, and whatnot. So some of the ideas around like what may be considered backstage in one culture might be considered more front stage in another culture. But the idea that this kind of dramaturgical framework maybe still applies cross-culturally. Is that kind of how you understand it as well?
And not being an expert in every culture, I'd be hard-pressed to imagine that some of this doesn't apply across every single culture. Certainly, though, there are going to be cultures where, as you said, there's less delineation because, for example, more tribal cultures, there's certainly going to be less delineation between front stage and backstage as every single person is sort of enmeshed in the group and sort of part of one sort of organization. So
Right. Cool. Well, maybe we can start kind of going through a little bit of the framework.
Yeah.
So this actually doesn't appear in the text, but in every kind of lecture I've heard about Goffman, they all kind of talk about this quote from Shakespeare's As You Like It. I think the whole quote is, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. And I think this is mentioned in all of these conversations because this is very key to like, Goffman's idea. He's kind of looking at everyday interactions through this lens of a performance, a stage performance, and is going to use a lot of the same kind of terminology.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that part certainly resonated a lot with me when I first read the book. It sort of felt like a lot of the times, at least at that point, I didn't feel a sense of authenticity about myself, being 18 years old and sort of trying to figure out who I was.
Yeah.
And sort of feeling like I had to perform in certain ways, particularly whether it be a student or, whatever sort of activity I was involved in on campus. We did talk a little bit, though, this doesn't always feel like the most perfect metaphor for a number of reasons. I mean, one is certainly with respect to a stage, actors get to sort of rehearse and make sure that they're 100% buttoned up and everything to say. As an example, as we're talking right now, and this is very ad hoc, we haven't written down every single one of our lines. So, most social interactions are much more spontaneous. And,
right.
I think the second point we talked about too is this idea that there isn't always a clean separation between audience and performer in everyday life. Each of us, as we're talking to each other right now, are both audience and performer to ourselves and the other person. So
totally, yeah. So he actually brings up both of those points of like why this is not a perfect metaphor. Actually, like in the first page. In a theater performance, it's very clear. There are the actors on the stage, and then there's literally the audience watching. But in our everyday interactions, like you said, we are playing both of those parts simultaneously as well as the other person.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, I think looking at it yourself as both is really important in this context because as, for example, we're talking right now, I'm giving you a particular performance of who I am, but I'm also likewise the audience to who you are. Right. So at both moments, we're sort of giving off information. We're also trying to receive information. And based off of that, as we'll get into sort of, understanding what the definition of the situation is between you and I in this room and, trying to keep a coherent perspective on that definition. So
Absolutely. So one of the things Goffman says we are doing when we are being an audience, like, so if I'm being the audience to you, observing your behavior and your performance, how you're kind of performing to me, it is also instructing my performance and how I'm performing to you. So it's hard to kind of strip away these things, as being two separate things because they very much like inform one another.
Yeah, we're each sort of iterating off of each other, and through that process, sort of becoming the person we feel like we want to or need to be in front of the other person. And that, as it pertains to, for example, you and I, is going to be unique to the particular circumstances that we find ourselves in and our pre-existing relationship, which could be very different from how I perform and act, or how I might be the audience member for somebody totally separate in my life in a separate context. So.
Right. Which is, that's another kind of big thing, is that we, as the Shakespeare quote alludes to, we play very many different roles. The role that I'm going to play, amongst my high school buddies is very different than when I'm hanging out with my philosophy friends, than when I'm hanging out with my grandmother or something.
Right. Yeah. I guess the one sort of, contrast between sort of the stage idea here is that even though that, yes, there's going to be very different personality, traits expressed as between me and you versus other people in my life, there are obviously a lot of consistencies, and that's sort of something that goes away once someone takes off the mask or the hood or whatever it is that they're sort of putting on when they're on stage. So
yeah. He talks a lot about how whenever we're interacting with another person, he doesn't use the word stereotyping, but I think that's pretty much what he's talking about here. We're kind of making these stereotypes about what kind of a person this is in order to kind of both know what to expect from them in the future, and to kind of surmise what kind of person they might have been in the past, right? Because you only have basically what's in front of you. The less information you know about a person, the more you're going to try to, take what little you do see in front of you and kind of extrapolate on that and make these inferences on, oh, well, he, when I met him, he was very outgoing. Therefore, Jason's a very outgoing guy. Whereas, maybe they just caught you on like a very rare day that you were outgoing. Maybe that's not actually indicative of your personality, but I don't know. Any thoughts on just that idea of making inferences about what you see in front of you?
Yeah, first impressions matter, right? And the main reason I think Goffman would argue that is because it anchors for the audience the expectations about what that person is and isn't. And I think that, moving from there, there's going to be an expectation that person acts substantially consistent with the first impression they give into the audience.
When we were putting together our outline, that word consistency kept coming up.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a crucial part of this, is when we'll get into like what makes a performance fail towards the end, it's basically a incompatibility or an inconsistency in performance.
Yeah, I think the word consistency or coherence is probably the highlight that everyone should be thinking about as we go through this, because, at the end of the day, both interpersonally in terms of expectations from other people, but also intrapersonally in terms of how I think about myself and wanting to sort of have this consistent sense of self. It just seems to be like the highlight of what the societal expectation is of us as persons. And I think this word trustworthiness is important. It's probably from an evolutionary perspective, thinking that if you see somebody and how they act, you want to make sure that they're going to be able to be trustworthy moving forward. And I think that consistency sort of plays along with that. If you see someone acting erratically, your first thought is, can I trust this person to, behave themselves or to be safe around in terms of, everyday interactions. So
right. He gives an example, like a very practical example of like, if I invite this person to a dinner party, like, can I trust them to not just like steal shit from my house when I'm not looking?
Yeah. And this word comes up a lot throughout society, right? We think of it in terms of trustworthiness, maybe with respect to the people that we bring close. You can think about the word like reliability with respect to like work, in terms of is someone going to be able to show up for me the next day and perform the way we need them to. So yeah, I think that's a huge thing that he's sort of hitting upon and highlighting in every single facet of his argument. And we'll certainly return to that as we get to, further along in the book.
Absolutely. All right. We could talk maybe about this term he uses called working consensus. Do you want to maybe take a stab at what that means for Goffman?
Yeah. Working consensus really goes to this idea, that entering into a new connection with somebody, or even connections that you sort of previously might have established, there's an implicit agreement between the parties about how to act in that particular arrangement.
Yeah.
So as we've sat down at this table and started talking, there's an agreement that I'm not going to be checking my phone for texts, and, you're not going to be putting a call into your mother. Like, we're going to act as though we're having a podcast and we're having a dialogue between each other, even if there are things happening off camera, so to speak, that, we're sort of working through. So, that again goes to this level of coherency, which is to say that once we've established that working consensus or definition of the situation, there's an expectation that we're going to work together to continue it in some fashion. And, as we'll talk more about, there are moments where sometimes things will happen that go awry, and sort of what we need to do in those moments to kind of rectify that. So yeah, that's my general understanding of
So
it.
it's kind of the expectation that is set. And one of the examples he gives in the book is a teacher on the first day of school kind of coming in and being very strict and kind of like a disciplinarian, because they want to basically set the tone that like, hey, this is how it's going to be in my classroom.
Yeah.
Whereas if, the first couple weeks of school, they're kind of a pushover, and then they decide, hey, I'm going to kind of like step it up, the kids aren't going to take them seriously. And again, it's going to be, an inconsistent performance in that, like, well, you've acted like a pushover for the last 2 weeks. How are we supposed to respect you?
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately with any working consensus, you have to take a step back and ask yourself, what is the objective of the situation, of the dynamic, of the relationship, of the conversation? With respect to the teacher, they're trying to establish a situation where students are going to listen to them and ultimately want to learn and take away the information they're trying to get to them. So if they're walking into a room of students who, they're concerned, would otherwise want to goof off and do other things, like they might take that stance. This is a good example with respect to Goffman that's sort of specific to the time period he might be working in, right? There's other places in the world where students can be very eager to learn, in which case you don't really have to take that perspective, because teachers already sort of have a reverence, or students are taught to have a reverence towards their teachers in some ways. So, it just sort of depends on the context and the room that you're walking into. Do you think it's going to be a bunch of hard-ass students, or do you think it's going to be a bunch of people who really want to learn and engage and take what you have to say, and apply it? So.
He gives also an example of like when the working consensus is violated. He gives this example of a sailor. It's kind of a weird example. Weird in modern times. A sailor kind of coming home back to his family after being at sea for a couple of months, and he tells his mother to pass the fucking butter. And I guess it's like, obviously a failed performance in that, like, he's speaking to his mother as if she were another sailor that he's been with for the last 6 months or whatever.
Yeah. And this is, again, important to, focus on this idea that there's going to be different working consensuses amongst different groups of people.
Yeah.
And, you're sort of forced constantly kind of switch between different performances, depending on who's in front of you and sort of what that consensus is. And if you're away for a while, you might forget the working consensus at times, and sort of slip into, those sort of faux pas that we'll talk about later in terms of failed performances.
Working consensus with mom at the dinner table is don't drop the F-bomb.
Yeah.
For most people.
I mean,
maybe not for everybody, but
probably not in the share my household, but 1950s, I can understand. So,
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's keep going. Let's move into this area of performances. So this is like the first chapter. He talks about this idea called idealization. I think this idea is probably not foreign to a lot of people. It's just the idea that we present ourselves in the way that we want others to perceive us.
Yeah. My mind always goes to the situation when you first start dating somebody and you have to sort of think about, when do I reveal to them X thing about me? Is it a fourth date issue or a fifth date issue? I think we all want to be presenting ourselves in the most positive light. We want to try to, sharpen and level everything that is about us in a way that feels maybe idealistic, and pointing to the actual term itself. I think the flip side is trying to give up an impression that is accurate enough that the other person can continue to consent to the definition of the situation, i.e., wanting to be in front of you, having this relationship in front of, and that can be the sort of the challenge. And I think, there will be instances like Goffman talks about where people will, perhaps not necessarily be the most authentic in the hopes that their performance will sort of win over, customers or whatever it might be. So,
right. Well, the kinds of things that we try to present ourselves to, he says a lot of these are kind of the ideals of society. So something like wealth or, good education. But I thought it was interesting too, is it's not necessarily those things. Because he gives some examples of people who are in situations where they are trying to appear less smart than they actually are, or appear to have less money than they do.
Yeah.
I think one of the examples was like during the 1930s. What's the term for the
Great Depression?
The Great Depression. Yes, thank you. During the Great Depression, it's like a family that was on welfare that I guess didn't need to be, was like basically still collecting welfare. So whenever the welfare agent came, they basically hid all of their, possessions that a welfare agent might look at and say, hey, you guys don't actually need this.
Yeah, and I mean, the other example I think he gives, which again sort of dates his, the nature of his book, but, women will pretending to sort of be less intelligent than they actually are in order to sort of, not lose the interest of a man who might be threatened by the fact that they might be more intelligent than them.
Right.
I think the takeaway is we try to idealize ourselves in front of others based off of what we think they want from us. And whether that's somebody ideal, in most circumstances, it's going to be things like, showing that we're in shape, we're well off, that we're intelligent, all those things. But there could be instances where we don't want those factors because the situation doesn't call for it.
Right. The other kind of, some of these other terms he uses, mystification, which I kind of understood as a form of idealization. So let's see, mystification is, it's when a performer limits the amount of exposure that they have in front of an audience in order to sustain a sense of awe and idealization in the audience's eyes. There's actually kind of pop history psychology book called 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene that I read. And one of the laws of power was use absence in order to increase respect and honor. And basically that idea of like, by limiting the amount of exposure, they are going to kind of idealize you more. They're going to kind of fill in that blank with, their own idealization of what they maybe want you to be.
Yeah, it's sort of negative idealization, right? You're not only trying to portray all the qualities that you think the other person wants, but you're also trying to hide away any sense that you might have any of the ones that they don't.
Yeah.
And the less that you can give about yourself beyond sort of the idealization points, the more likely, I think, in theory, that they are to sort of desire to be a part of whatever sort of situation we're part of here. So
there's the quote, like, no man is a hero in front of his own valet. And I think that speaks to this as well, of like, because the valet, is constantly with that person. They see, them fart, or they see them get really angry and lose their temper. Like they kind of see all of these kind of backstage behaviors. Yeah,
that's another element too, is, we'll talk a little bit about this, but sort of like the audience segregation piece of not only hiding away certain qualities of yourself in order to sort of create this mystification, but also doing it in front of people who don't know you that well otherwise, who can't contradict that either because they've seen you in different ways, or because, they may have seen you who you were before you became the person you are today.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe we can talk about this term he uses, audience segregation.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is pretty much what it sounds like. You're kind of making an effort to keep your audiences separate in order to not kind of contradict performances as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it is very interesting. I noticed it when I was reading this. I was kind of reflecting about my own life as well. And so I teach drum lessons. Yeah. That's one of the things I do for a living. And one of my students saw my kind of podcasting equipment in the basement and asked what it was. And I told him the truth. I was like, oh, I have a podcast. And he's like, what's your podcast called? And I was like, I ended up telling him because I was like, I don't have anything to hide here. But I was thinking, like, if this student were to listen to my podcast, they would have a very different impression of me than the one that they currently have. Because, the kind of performance, if we want to use Goffman's language, that I'm giving when I'm teaching a drum lesson is to a 10-year-old is very different than, the performance that I'm giving now where I'm speaking about Goffman's ideas. So I did feel a little bit of resistance to that because there was that kind of impulse to kind of, keep my audiences separate so as not to, I guess, again, to use Goffman's terms, kind of have a failed performance or an inconsistent performance.
Yeah. And the key thing there is that when you made all those podcasts in the past, you weren't thinking about your drum student as a potential audience member, so you weren't creating a particular performance that would be catered around that, versus right now, even though no one knows my last name, I am thinking about how this performance would jive with my job and whether, like, if someone listened from my work, what they would think about it. So, Now, am I thinking about every possible person in my life and like what my parents would think about it? No. So there's always going to be people that you overlook. And then that can be the sort of element of like, well, wait a minute, did I make sure that when I did these 20 podcast episodes or whatever it might be, that I made sure that everything I said is consistent with the impression I've been giving to him so far is probably what you've been struggling with.
Yeah. No, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Yeah. I think that's exactly it. The other example too, I think of is, if you've ever had a party where you invite a bunch of friends from different circles or people that know you in different ways.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to kind of watch yourself in those moments.
Yeah, it's a little bit like kind of, for whatever reason, this metaphor that kind of pops to mind is like the scene at the end of Terminator 2 where the enemy Terminator drops into the vat of lava and he's sort of transforming into all the different versions of himself that he's sort of portrayed. It's like you just have this like moment of like kind of explosion where you're like, I don't know who I'm supposed to be in this moment because even though I am relatively consistent, hopefully across those various groups of people, there are enough subtle differences that like, well, this person over here thinks this of me and this person here thinks of something different. Like, I'm not sure what to do with myself now. And I know for sure I get a lot of agita in those moments when I have sort of disparate groups of friends kind of coming together in one. So,
you just, I guess, turn to mystification. Just be like, I gotta go, guys.
Yeah, that's when you leave.
Have fun idealizing me while I'm gone. I guess one other section, at least to me, in this first chapter where he's talking about performances was dramatization, and it's basically the idea that sometimes we will dramatize what we are doing as opposed to just merely doing it, especially in instances where when we're doing the thing, it might not actually be clear to people that see us that we are doing something. He talks about different professions and that some professions are just inherently dramatic, like a prize fighter or a surgeon, right? When a prize fighter is fighting or a surgeon is doing surgery, it's very clear to everybody that they are engaged in the thing that they're engaged in.
Right.
Where he gives the example of nurses. A lot of times when nurses are working, they might be talking to another nurse about somebody's medication, or they might be talking to a patient about, whatever. And to other patients or other people in the hospital, it might just look like they're just, messing around, like they're not actually engaged in their job.
Right.
So he was saying for people like this who don't have an inherently dramatic role, they might actually kind of go out of their way to dramatize what they're doing in order to be perceived as working.
Yeah, I mean, and this can go to an extreme level too, right? I mean, this is, he quotes in the book, he talks about Jean-Paul Sartre talking about how, sometimes if you're sort of the teacher's pet in a class, you might be spending so much time trying to demonstrate to the professor that you're listening that you might actually not have the psychic energy to be paying attention to what the professor's even saying.
Yeah.
So it can backfire. But yeah, I mean, I think there are certain roles, as you said, where people might not otherwise perceive that particular person doing their job unless they sort of put on a bit of a show in order to sort of exemplify what they're supposed to be doing. And, I think that goes to the sense of, as we talked about earlier, but like the kind of impression you're trying to foster for most people at its base is one in which that you are somebody who is trustworthy and somebody who, is productive and somebody who ultimately knows what they're doing. And, if that isn't coming across from the nature of your work itself, you have to sort of overperform to demonstrate that. So,
right. Yeah. I loved that Sartre example. It was very funny. Maybe we can move into some more of this terminology. So this is chapter called Regions.
Yeah.
And he talks about front stage and backstage.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really important section here.
Yeah, pretty vital. I mean, we've been hitting upon a little bit so far, but I think of the front stage as sort of where this sort of performance, where this sort of working consensus is supposed to be happening, and which there's exchange between a performer and an audience, and then the backstage is where any of that's not supposed to be happening effectively with respect to this particular performance.
Yep.
You think of in the context of the one example that always comes to mind is like a waiter or waitress at a restaurant who's behaving a certain way in front of the customers, and then they might go back to the kitchen and start cursing amongst the chefs.
Right.
It's a very different kind of persona back there than it might be sort of the one they want to give to the people that are potentially tipping them. So
absolutely. Yeah. And he defines backstage as, this is a quote from the book, he says, backstage may be defined as a place relative to a given performance where the impression fostered by the performance is knowingly contradicted as a matter of course. So yeah, the example you just gave, if the moment you're kind of backstage in the kitchen, you start, cussing at the chef or whatever, you are kind of knowingly acting in a way that you would not behave if you were in the front stage.
Yeah, although I will say that this definition does feel a bit constrained in the sense that I think maybe how I'd phrase it is the backstage is an area where you feel like you have the freedom to act as you wish in comparison to the performance you're giving in the front stage. So that is to say, if I'm that waiter who is, leaving the front stage and going back with the chefs, I could very much curse, or I could very much act like the same person I am in front of all the customers. But it's the sense that I'm not as constrained by the definition of the situation I've established with the customers, and I have the freedom to be able to do other things and behave in other ways around the people that again, I'm not getting tips from. So we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on, with respect to this idea of definitions of situations sort of being constrained on individual freedom, because it sort of restricts who you're allowed to be in any given moment. So.
Well, he uses these words front stage and backstage, but part of it depends on the performance, right? And we're constantly engaged in several performances. So to use the waiter example again, the waiter's performance for the diners, the people he's serving, is one performance in which the backstage would be the kitchen, right? But he's also engaged in a performance with the chef. So in that case, the kitchen may be front stage and the dining room may be backstage for that.
Right.
So I think that is worth pointing out, that there's kind of it's always context dependent on which performance you're talking about, and there are several performances happening simultaneously, right?
Yeah. And I mean, certainly this kind of, reduction can kind of go on forever if you think about it, right? I mean, if you say that the backstage of the, kitchen is is with respect to the front stage of, the restaurant, the back area, the alley where someone's having a cigarette could be the backstage there. And then you going home could be the, the backstage to the front stage of the alley. If you're, so there's a lot of ways you sort of go down the rabbit hole, and, we'll talk more a little about that. Where do you sort of end up? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Well, he also talks about, there are some areas that are kind of more traditionally front stage and more traditionally backstage. So, something like a church where everybody congregates, that would be a front stage. Like a lot of churches have a literal stage.
Yeah.
Backstage, a bathroom, even a basement, something like that. But in this context, like we're in my basement right now,
this
is very much front stage.
Exactly.
So it does kind of depend on the context.
Yeah, and I would say too that the lines aren't always as clear as you sort of think about in the context of a stage presence. Again, going to that analogy, there are going to be moments, let's say, for example, within, a party at someone's house, right, where, your performance in front of somebody is going to potentially differ in terms of how you perform to the person next to you. But like, because they're there, the amount that you sort of signal to the person in front of you might differ slightly depending on, you might say certain things, or you might, have a certain body language towards them, but it could be muddled by the fact that there isn't as much of a delineation that it would be if that other person wasn't even there to begin with. So, and and again, doors aren't always as closed. You're sort of walking across things. So in any given moment, who you are and how you're trying to portray yourself is going to change pretty, second by second, moment by moment in some instances. So
that's a great point. In that, like, backstage could literally just be out of a person's eyesight.
Yeah, or hearing.
And I guess there was some kind of an example of, when people will kind of mock somebody, a lot of times they'll kind of mock them when that person is not present.
Right.
But in extreme examples, you would see that person like mocking that person right behind that person.
Yeah.
So in that case, literally the same room just behind them could be considered backstage by this
Yeah, we see plenty of examples of that in like, comedies and I mean, Mr. Bean or whatever it might be, where, somebody's just very upset with the professor or whoever it is, and, sort of mocking to everyone else in the class, like this person's an idiot kind of situation. So, it's definitely a cultural idea concept that's sort of repeated over and over again. This idea that it's acceptable to try to get as close as possible to the front stage with that person while, being able to be contrarian in the back. It's almost like a challenge.
Right, right. Two other kind of thoughts on this. He gives an example of how the same location can be front stage at one moment and backstage at another. I think he gave the example of like somebody using their living room as to host a dinner party on like a Saturday night, very much making that living room front stage. And then the next morning, they're just kind of, slumping around in their pajamas. It's very much backstage. So same room, but, different time of day, context, etc.
Yeah, I think again, with respect to a stage, even then, I think the analogy does kind of work in the sense that stages don't always stay static. People will change over the musicals and shows that are in the stage, and it might be one thing one night, and the next night it's a brand new thing. So even in that context, I think it's understandable that regions will change over.
Absolutely. Sorry, let me just check here. Oh, this is, again, one of these things is probably kind of obvious, but he says we often conceal any dirty work from the audience that we want to hide backstage. And this, I guess this dirty work might even just be, not the typical, like real dirty work, like, burying bodies or anything like that. But, putting on makeup or putting on deodorant, again, kind of the things that would actually happen in a backstage for like a theater performance.
Yeah, even something like, you taking a moment to try to find something in your notes and then cutting it when you actually put this together.
Yeah.
So that the audience doesn't realize that you had to take a break to do that. I think this whole thing is very meta in the sense that whatever they're hearing is certainly not the whole truth, nothing but the truth in terms of what's happening. And, there's plenty of breaks. We probably had to walk away to go to the bathroom at some point, but that's not what they're going to get at the end. At the end, they're going to get this nice coherent conversation that sounds like there's no breaks and we don't cough or do anything out of the ordinary.
100%.
And that's sort of the dirty work that you has to go into the many hours you're going to spend editing this.
I love it. Yeah. I'm going to leave that awkward pause in just for that.
You should, 100%. Yeah. I'm going to take a sip of water while we do this to sort of acknowledge that point.
Good. Well, yeah, I guess that also just goes, again, kind of to this idea of, in the internet age, we are very much living in a very kind of curated space in that, like, what we see on Instagram or social media or what we hear in a podcast is very much the finished product.
Yeah.
And all of the kind of, making of the sausage is very deliberately hidden.
I think this just, again, highlights this idea, this pressure that we feel in society, this internalized pressure to try to make ourselves sort of as idyllic and sort of static as possible so that people can kind of take away from us, a one sort of snapshot idea of the kind of message we're trying to convey. And the more that we can kind of compress that down into a single photo or a single tweet or whatever it might else be, the easier it is for us to kind of maintain that impression in our eyes. So
100%.
Yeah.
Well, kind of going off of, us getting a little bit meta here and talking about our own performance that we're giving right now as we record this podcast, he has this whole chapter talking about teams. And it's basically this idea that, a lot of our performances are in concert with other people.
Yeah.
So I'm not only kind of performing right now for you and for my audience, but we are kind of putting a performance together for the audience.
Right.
And so if you were to, start like acting crazy or saying racist things or factually incorrect things, that would reflect poorly on our team right now.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think it's really essential. He, of course, coming from the 1950s, focuses on this idea of like, a family hosting a dinner and, the way that the husband and wife behave with each other might be different in terms of how they might behave outside of that context. But they sort of either explicitly or implicitly sort of agreed that they're going to behave a certain way, such as to give off an impression together that they are this sort of wholesome family that is like behaving by the rules of a dinner party etiquette.
And just to touch on that, I think he says basically like the wife will act kind of more submissive to him whilst in the company of their friends and family as she would when they're just at home by themselves or something like that.
Right. Yeah, no, again, very dated, but that is the example he gives. So yeah, so as it pertains to us, clearly we're working together in this circumstance in terms of, when it feels like the other person is getting close to the end of their thought, being ready to sort of jump in and say something else. We spent a pretty fair amount of time going through and sort of outlining this so that we know what we would be talking about and knowing that we're hitting upon specific points, including the fact that we're talking about specifically the fact that we are a team working together, right? This is very meta almost,
Yeah.
But, I think it's important, even if we don't acknowledge that this is happening, because, it's helpful if you feel like you're in certain places in life where you're with somebody or with a group of people and you're not sort of ending up in a situation where you're conveying the message or the idea to the group that you're focusing on. It might be an opportunity to sort of take a step back and ask yourself, are you having the necessary conversations with your teammates about how, this is supposed to go down? Because sometimes people get it implicitly and they sort of go off of each other. And I feel like we're doing a bit of that now, but sometimes it's rehearsed and sometimes there is a lot of effort that has to go in the background. And, it always feels bad when you're in a situation, you're doing a team project, for example, and you're left to do all the work, or you're doing a team project and the other team goes off the rails. So that happens a lot in life, and it's something to definitely prioritize. So.
No, that's a great point. And that, he talks about how we kind of coordinate with our team members backstage kind of before the performance. So yeah, in this case, we kind of coordinated, we put it together, a rough outline so we knew how to move through the material. Some of the examples he uses from the book are kind of more kind of like corporate examples, and in terms of talking to your employees before their shift starts on how to act on the floor or whatnot. But yeah, it could also, be something like a parent kind of talking to their kid about being on their best behavior when they go to grandma's house. So it's not just a matter of I want you to be on your best behavior because, you should respect your grandma. It's if you're not on your best behavior, grandma's going to think less of me and our team as family. Yeah.
And children are wonderful in this way because, they're not adept quite yet at sort of fostering the working consensus, and will oftentimes, lead to sort of failed performances simply by being who they are. Yeah, the word that I think that Goffman may use, but certainly I always think about is discretion, right? Is a child of the age where they sort of understand the need for discretion on particular activities or particular things to talk about during that sort of interaction. So
100%. Yeah, I think he even says a lot of times young children will be kind of left out of this kind of backstage rehearsal because they can't be trusted to be discreet.
Right.
Let's maybe move into some of these discrepant roles.
Yeah.
So these are basically other people in a performance that are not audience or performer.
Right.
He talks about the informer. This is basically somebody who is pretending like they are a part of the team, but really they are part of the audience.
Yeah.
So this could be, he talks about a spy.
Right.
That's...
Yeah, that's an easy example. Somebody who goes to a trade show and tries to pretend like they're a customer to figure out how a device works or gets better knowledge on it so they can take it back and build their own competition, easy example.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or I guess anybody who's, wearing a wire or something like that, or like a rat or a mole. I guess the other side of that is what he calls a shill, which this is somebody who is a part of the team but pretends like they are part of the audience. So the opposite.
Yeah.
The example he gives is a husband and wife at a dinner party, and the wife is kind of pretending like she's never heard the husband's stories before and laughing along and kind of setting him up for different punchlines.
Right.
So she's very much a part of the team, but she's acting like she's never heard this before.
Yeah.
So this one was interesting too. He talks about the non-person.
Yeah.
You want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah. Non-persons are people that are physically present for a presentation, but who are basically trained, or their jobs are to basically appear like they aren't. I mean, the easiest example is like a servant or people who are part of the help or the staff that, are sort of obviously going to be there in terms of, providing food and cleaning up. But if there's like some huge argument that breaks out between the family, they're sort of trained to have the discretion to basically ignore it and not bring it up and not be engaged at all in what's happening there. So almost their responsibilities are beyond obviously whatever their services are, is to sort of pretend like they don't exist.
Absolutely. He says a lot of times non-persons are people from low socioeconomic status, or he talks about like it could be a very young child or a very old person or somebody who's mentally handicapped, and that like, I don't know, I think of like a parents maybe would be okay having sex in front of their baby if their baby is like very young, right? They don't make the baby leave the room necessarily, but as that baby gets older, the baby is no longer a non-person.
I think then I look at it sort of in two perspectives. There's the one where it's sort of the non-person by nature of some sort of like physical characteristic, like they might, they might be too young to understand things. They might have dementia or some other, physical ailment or mental ailment that sort of prevents them from understanding the circumstances. And then there's the ones who might otherwise be able to sort of understand and comprehend, but are sort of trained themselves not to based off the circumstances. So
right. Or just don't have the option to, I mean, he gives an example of a book of like a white slave owner having a slave girl sleep in him and his wife's bedroom in order to basically like, give them a glass of water in the middle of the night if they wanted it or something. But they were, at least according to Goffman, he said that they didn't change their behavior at all. Yeah. And again, it's the sad reality of like this slave girl like would not have been able to tell anybody the kind of backstage stuff that goes on because, the consequences for her would be so severe.
Yeah. And I think the one thing you might be hitting upon the most is that oftentimes these moments of non-personhood are, not a consequence of somebody specifically getting paid in a fair share to sort of not pretend they're a person, but oftentimes they're being exploited in some way to sort of keep quiet and pretend like they aren't there. So.
Absolutely. Well, and I guess that transitions us well into, he talks about service specialists and training specialists. So essentially the service specialists are paid people who are kind of aiding the person's performance kind of behind the scenes. So a dentist working on your teeth is very much helping you in your performance of, somebody with good dental hygiene. One other thing I wanted to mention with this that I think relates to the non-persons is because the training specialists are in this kind of unique position to see a lot of these performers backstage. The dentist is seeing your bad teeth. The banker has access to how much money you have. Your doctor has, all of this kind of backstage information to your medical history. There are a lot of times like legal ramifications for them spreading that information.
Yeah. And one thing I will draw a distinction, because I know we've sort of been using these terms interchangeably, but, just for people listening, so service specialist, I think is really this point about somebody who provides a particular service to an individual. So we think about doctors, nurses, dentists, whereas a training specialist is somebody who sort of helps to instruct somebody in a new, the kind of activity that they're a person they're trying to be. So his example would be, you training people on the drums, or, the first example is with respect to parents who are sort of raising their children to behave a certain way. So there's a distinction there, but they both share a lot of similarities in the sense that they are effectively providing some sort of service, whether it's, physical, service on the person or emotional or, some sort of training element, that is distinct from, sort of the backstage of them having the requisite knowledge and specialty to be able to give the information that the other person needs or the service the other person needs. So.
For sure. And he talks about like the training specialists are the ones that kind of knew you when. So they kind of have a kind of inside glimpse at this person's backstage life that most of the audience doesn't. And I think this is one of the interesting things you see with a lot of like celebrities and stars is that the one person that kind of keeps them really grounded and humbled is the person that trained them at a young age, right? Because it's like, oh yeah, I knew Lady Gaga when she couldn't sing and, was all out of pitch. So it's like anytime, and this is a hypothetical example, I don't know if she actually has a teacher like this, but like, if she were to kind of come into the contact with that teacher, it's just like, oh, this person, knew me back before I was a star, back before I could actually sing. So they kind of have this special access to this person's backstage life that kind of keeps them grounded.
Yeah. And I think, maybe taking a little bit of a higher approach at this moment, this is where that term coherence comes back into play. Because, in order for you to maintain a coherent, definition of the situation with somebody else and thus a coherent performance of them over time, it necessarily requires that if you're going to make any changes to yourself, that they have to kind of happen pretty incrementally. So, the issue is that who you might be now sitting here, in your 30s is going to be very different than this sort of person who knew us back when you're, in the teens or even 20s. And such that you've probably gotten past whatever sort of performance or sort of sense, presentation of self that you were giving then. And so it goes again to a similar idea of like having all your different friend groups in the same room in terms of like, who am I supposed to be? Because this person who knew you back when is probably at least expecting, that there is some coherence with respect to who you were and sort of where that trajectory led. And if you're veered off, a very different direction based off of what that might have been or what the expectation might have been, it could be really uncomfortable for you to sort of have to face that person and say, no, this is the person I'm presenting myself as now. And it's nowhere near where I started off. I understand,
Right.
And there's that sense of authenticity, right? I mean,
yeah.
You worry about, I had you watch this movie I recommend this movie and you watched it recently, The New Guy. Which was like 20, 30 years ago it came out. But basically the short summary is there's a kid who's like having trouble at school and he's like basically being fun of, and he sort of transfers to a different school and then like becomes like the cool guy because like he's the bad boy. He's able to like foster an entirely different impression of himself.
Yeah.
But then like his old past kind of eventually creeps up on him eventually and sort of reveals what happened. And, it's that sense of like that, oh, snap moment where like all of a sudden that like the past meets who I am now and I'm not able to sort of hide the fact that I made this change,
Right. They're two kind of incompatible performances.
Yeah.
And I think they end up like bringing a videotape of, this guy and showing the whole school that like, hey, this is actually the same person who is this nerd. And his reputation as the bad boy completely falls apart, right? Because this, complete inconsistency in performance.
Who would have thought such a profound lesson from an early 2000s junk movie, So
100%. Yeah. But do we want to kind of maybe use that as a springboard to kind of talk about failed performances?
Sure.
So what causes a performance to fail?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple things. I mean, the main one, again, going back to this point of coherence, is when the performance eventually veers off from being coherent anymore. Right. Where whatever, definition of the situation that you've been trying to foster this whole time kind of falls to pieces. And the extreme example, obviously the one you just gave, when someone's trying to come off as a particular person and people find out that they're anything but that person in real life, or at least the life before then, it sort of gets to this sense of who is the person I'm actually looking at now? Which impression should I be trusting? And, where are we supposed to go from here? Look, that's an extreme example. Certainly we can think about the context of most day-to-day, social interactions. There's going to be plenty of moments where there's inconsistency, right? I mean, even just now, I was like kind of taking a pause to try to think about what I wanted to say, and so it didn't come off as smoothly. And there I am again, smoothly as I sort of wanted to do, to speak. So
right.
Those are moments where, you're going to say like, right, or okay, and you're going to keep me going because that's sort of what this is supposed to be about, right? It's supposed to be a conversation, and it's supposed to be, if we're thinking about in the sense of the analogy of a stage, we want to feel very like it's the lines are already, rehearsed and everyone knows exactly what to say and it's delivered perfectly, But I think one thing that he really highlights and is really important is that, we oftentimes fail to sort of see or acknowledge that most performances would fail if not for the tact of the audience to sort of understand that things are going to fail even slightly over time, and to sort of help to reestablish the definition of the situation by, either ignoring it entirely or by helping the person along by, giving them, support in certain ways so they can reestablish whatever, definition they were trying to go for. So.
That's such a great point. I love that Goffman talks about that. It's a kind of what he calls like looking away. You're kind of turning a little bit of a blind eye to a faux pas or a kind of, quote unquote mistake in performance. Example I thought of from my life, when my grandpa was getting kind of towards the end of his life, he would often like fart pretty loudly at the dinner table. Mm-hmm. And it was one of these things where everybody heard it, right?
Right.
You can't not hear it, but it's very much impolite to address. And we all kind of didn't want to make him feel embarrassed or whatever. So it's just everybody heard it, but nobody heard it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's one of those instances where the audience is using tact to kind of, look away.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the word impolite to describe it in terms of, it's impolite to acknowledge it, right? And I think this is something that I really took very strongly away from this book, even when I read it the first time 15 years ago, is this sort of moral component to fostering a definition of the situation. He says, and this is probably one of the few times I'm going to quote the book, but he says on page 13 of the book, the version that I have, he says, "We must not overlook the crucial fact that any projected definition of the situation also has a distinctive moral character." And this is sort of where he goes into initially talking about this idea that, we're putting a moral demand upon others, obliging them to value and treat him in the manner that persons of his kind have a right to expect, and that in doing so, implicitly foregoing all claims to be things he does not appear to be. So this is this idea of tying together these two concepts, that the reason I think Goffman thinks that we're so compelled to try to keep a consistent, coherent definition of the situation, an example with your grandfather, for example, not acknowledging the farts, is because we feel some sort of moral obligation being a person in society to sort of adhere to these list of principles, one of which being that we're professing to be the people that we are, and then we aren't hiding things that we aren't, that we're honest, that we're trustworthy, and that we aren't going to act erratically the next time you see us in terms of what we've given you in front of you now versus later. And, we'll talk a little bit later about whether ultimately this is, a healthy thing to have. I mean, certainly for the sake of, social structures, it makes sense. But on the individual level, does it make sense that we feel so much pressure to behave so consistently and not to be able to venture out beyond sort of the initial definition of the situation we foster with the people? So.
Yeah, I love that you bring up that point. He actually uses the word promises too. And that like the way in which we behave when we're with other people is a kind of promise of how we are going to behave with them in the future. And we often don't think about it like that, but really that's where I think he says that it has this moral component of like, it's not just that you are, acting in this certain way around somebody. It's that you're kind of promising them that this is who I am, and this is how I will behave the next time that you see me, and the next time you see me after that.
Yeah. The idea of a promise definitely feels very akin to the idea of a social contract, that we've sort of all agreed implicitly to sort of a certain set list of behaviors and activities in order to sort of live, diplomatically amongst ourselves. So,
yeah. Maybe we can get a little bit more kind of granular when it comes to failed performances.
Yeah.
He talks a little bit about false notes, and he says false notes is a small inconsistency in a performance that makes the audience feel that something is slightly off.
Yeah.
So he gives the analogy of like, somebody playing a piece on the piano or like a classical sonata or something, and the whole piece is perfect, but they hit a C instead of a C sharp at the very end, and it's just like that completely ruined the whole performance.
Right.
And how this might relate to a person's performance, right? It's like, I don't know, the bad boy example, the guy, he's wearing the right stuff, he's acting like a bad boy, this and that, and then I don't know, he says, "Please, can I have some tomatoes at Chipotle," or whatever, and just that word "please," it's just like, it's a false note, right? Something's off. It's like this doesn't mesh with your bad boy persona that you've been presenting.
Yeah, it's I think one thing that I take away from that too is it sort of depends on the particular audience. So the example that I immediately jumped to is this idea that you've given me in the past where like, you might be playing, let's say you're playing a performance with a band one night, and you have sort of your set list and you have your cue sheets in terms of what you're supposed to be playing, and you might play something off in terms of the drums. Most people might not notice it, but the band members might notice it, or the person behind stage who, is also a drummer might notice it. So there are times in which, those false notes will only hit certain members and other people might be totally oblivious to the fact, but I think the biggest takeaway is that oftentimes those false notes are things that are most apparent to us. And we start to feel a sense of shame and regret about those notes, and thus feel like we need to sort of take a step to try to, to rectify the situation. So that's sort of where I go when I think about that.
Well, in kind of building on that as well, kind of thinking about this in terms of teams with the false notes, use the example of like you're playing with a band and somebody makes a mistake, right? He says a lot of times what the team will do is kind of go along with the mistake in order to kind of work together to cover the mistake. Yeah. I remember playing in like a corporate wedding band here in New York, and one of the first things they told us is like, if the singer kind of goes to the chorus early, like, God damn it, everybody goes to the chorus early. Yeah. Right. So it's all about kind of working together to kind of hide the mistake.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the philosophy in improv about the yes and, it's to the extent that somebody says something out of left field, like you're supposed to go along with it, because the last thing you want to do is contradict your team member in front of an audience, literally in that instance, but certainly it applies everywhere else as well. So, yeah.
And I guess kind of related to that idea too, he talks about some of the things that a person might do if they are caught in a failed performance, or if they, slip up and do a false note. One of them is kind of this idea of like acting like that was their intent all along. I mean, I guess this is just another word for like gaslighting, essentially. But it's kind of this idea of like, you saw me slip up and it's like, oh, I meant for you to see me slip up, or this actually wasn't a slip up. This was actually part of what I intended you to see.
Yeah, there's this brilliant moment. I can never remember if it's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. I think the original is called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory with Gene Wilder. Okay, but I don't know if this is 100% true, but there was an idea that he made one request to the director in order to take the role, and that was, when he first comes out of the factory to the audience, he's going to let in the children. He sort of has this cane, and he's sort of walking very hobbling and clearly sort of trying to portray that he's injured. And then right at the end, he sort of drops the cane and then does a barrel roll and sort of jumps up and springs up as if he's like spry. And he wanted to do that to sort of convey to the audience watching the movie that you would never be able to trust whether Willy Wonka was being honest or not from that moment forth, because he basically contradicted his performance virtually immediately the moment you see him. So yeah, there's two ways there's almost three different ways you could take. The one is to play along. The second is there a way you can rectify it? And the third is to sort of portray yourself as somebody who is inconsistent, because if you are in fact somebody that isn't trustworthy at that moment, then, that can go to extreme sense. But, there are times in which that can be beneficial, because then the audience isn't concerning themselves about whether you are in fact acting consistent with that particular performance. So, yeah.
I don't remember that specific scene, but that is a good example. And I think it also points to the this idea of like, if somebody does see a failed performance or an inconsistency, it's going to kind of undermine all of your other performances. And he says something along the lines of like, even if you've been honest in every other area, it's going to kind of shed some doubt on that amongst the audience, right? They see that like, oh, this person, was clearly misrepresenting themselves here. How can I trust that they're not misrepresenting themselves here, here, and here?
I'll give another story time quickly, and you can decide if you want to keep it in. But we've talked about this one before. I'm an attorney. I've been an attorney for almost 10 years. And when I first got to law school, there was sort of a gathering amongst, my school had various sections. There were 6 or 7 of them. And so, you sort of get to know your section mates, because for the first year, those are the people you're going to be taking classes with. And when we first got to campus, there was someone who used to come by to some of the initial happy hours the first week, professing to be part of our section, and sort of being a student, and sort of gave this weird excuse for why we hadn't seen him at class, because they were in the process of sort of transferring to, a different section, or there was some sort of mix up. But otherwise was, generally a pretty consistent looking person in terms of how they behaved. They weren't acting erratic, right? Somebody that you could certainly imagine going to school with us. I got kind of curious at a certain point because it just didn't seem to all add up. And I eventually went to go look at the registrar and look for his name and realize that he wasn't a student. And so, a couple of us sort of called him out. I think we may have texted him sort of asking, what gives? We didn't see you on the registrar. What's happening?
Yeah.
And we just never heard from him again, and it's one of those moments where you just sort of realize, oh, this person has been deceiving us pretty convincingly for quite some time. And obviously, there were a couple false notes there, enough for us to sort of get wise to the situation.
Yeah.
But it caused you to kind of go back and reassess not only everything in terms of how you've viewed that person and whether you just missed something, but also your general trustworthiness of people in general, because you're like, well, if that person could deceive me so easily, what can other people do?
Yeah, right. So this is somebody who, his performance was discredited, right? He didn't have the authority to kind of give this performance. He was lying.
Right. Yeah.
Right? But there's other cases where I think it's a little bit more ambiguous. And he says, it may be repeated that no claim is made that surreptitious communications are any more a reflection of the real reality than are the official communications with which they are inconsistent. The point is that the performer is typically involved in both. And the way I understood this idea is, say I am caught kind of giving a performance that is kind of inconsistent with one that I've given in the past. It's not that this performance that was inconsistent is any more a reflection of the realer me than the other one.
Yeah.
The example I use is, again, if my 10-year-old drum student listens to my podcast and hears me, talking about philosophy and such, it's not that this me talking about philosophy is a more accurate reflection of the real me than the me that I am portraying when I am teaching a 10-year-old to play the drums. It is just that it's a different performance.
Yeah, and I think extrapolating off of that, if we feel this pressure to either segregate our performances because we feel like it would give people the sense that we aren't being authentic with them because we're acting differently over here, or if we feel like we can't transition our performance into something different because people would start to question whether this different thing is real or whether the initial thing is real. I think this is the point he hits again back on the moral character page on page 13, where he says, this role of the witness in limiting what is the individual has been, I guess this is a typo, has been stressed by existentialists who see it as a basic threat to individual freedom. Meaning that if we are in a position where we're constantly concerned that people are going to think that we're a phony, and not necessarily you think I'm a phony, but even myself, I might think I'm a phony if I'm sort of acting differently in a way that doesn't accord with how I'm currently sort of see myself. I can't try new things, for example, or venture into different areas, then it necessarily constricts us in terms of the people we're allowed to be throughout our lives. And in particular, if we do want to make changes, it often comes at the cost of having to take, an extreme amount of time to do it over the course of a very, slow trajectory, little incremental changes here and there.
Yeah.
One example you gave to me as we were sort of putting together this outline that I really resonate heavily with is this idea of going away on vacation and your ability to sort of be whoever you want to be, sort of like the new guy was able to be who he wants to be by going to a different school.
Yeah.
It's not that we often take advantage of that. And I think a lot of the reasons that we don't is because we feel this internalized pressure to be consistent even when we're around brand new people. But going into a place where I think, if I'm going to draw any level of sort of empathy with these sort of swindlers and people who sort of come into a school and pretend like they're a person they aren't, or, have a family way over here that's different than the one they have, in their residency, it's that they yearn to have this ability to sort of be somebody different and new, that they sort of feel constricted in their current circumstances, and not having the freedom to sort of branch out because they're so worried that people are going to think that something's wrong with them or that they're being insincere either with their initial performance or that they've been lying to them this whole time about who they were previously. So.
Yeah, no, I love that, thinking about going on a vacation as well. The other thing that you talked about that I wanted to highlight on was it's not just our performance for others, but it's also our performance for ourselves. And this kind of gets into this kind of intrapersonal aspect of it.
Yeah.
We're talking about these different levels of performances that are happening. Yes, we're performing for other people, but in a sense, we're also performing for ourselves. So even if like you said, we go on vacation, there might be some hesitancy to kind of act in the ways that we want to act, because even though these other people don't know us, like we still know us, and we're going to feel weird acting in a way we've never acted before, even if that's how we really genuinely feel in that moment.
Yeah. I mean, I always ask myself whenever I'm, with somebody new, I try to picture what that person might be like on a random Tuesday night alone in their apartment. They have no plans. They're not around other people. They're just allowed to be themselves. And, the truth is that I imagine that a lot of us in those moments are very similar to the people that we are everywhere else. And it's because, even when we are in the most backstage of backstage in our personal, residency and sort of away from everybody else alone, we still sort of wear the mask or the hood or whatever sort of other object you think about putting over your head in terms of being in this performance that we sort of created. It's very hard to turn off, and it's very hard to change into something entirely different, because what does it say about yourself if you're constantly in these different sort of personas alone versus who you are elsewhere? I mean, it's I imagine very difficult to kind of maintain a sense of self if you don't do that, even when you're not around the people that you're doing it for. So
I think that's 100% right. I mean, I remember hearing something about how people who have bipolar disorder really are frightened by that inconsistency of basically not knowing which of them is going to show up that day.
Yeah.
So I think there is a certain kind of security we get in, like, knowing who we are, knowing how we are likely to act. And at least personally, I would be like a little bit skeptical of, the answer to this is to just like say, okay, well, there is no fixed self, to just act however you want to act in the present moment. I would think that would be destabilizing as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very Buddhist perspective, and certainly there are elements of Buddhism, or at least like elements capturing what the Buddhist thought is trying to dispel throughout this book, right? This sense of trying to kind of constantly find a sense of permanency in self, sort of a fixed self, a sense of self that can't change, that is in tune, for example, with sort of bodily autonomy and bodily functions. The fact that we're sitting here and neither of us are burping or farting, right? Even if we might have an upset stomach, right? Sort of ignoring the elements of self and those are elements of our bodies in that moment to sort of preserve the sense of, person that we're creating, I think is something that I see consistently throughout what Goffman's writing here. I think the other thing, if we're talking about this from an intrapersonal perspective, and I'll read from the book on page 81, he says, "It will have been necessary for the individual in his performing capacity to conceal from himself and his audience capacity the discreditable facts that he has had to learn about the performance. In everyday terms, there will be things he knows or has known that he will not be able to tell himself."
Yeah.
It's such a little tongue twister, because at the end of the day, he's talking from the perspective of us both as audience and as performer for ourselves.
Right.
And when I hear this, I think a lot about, in Jungian sense of shadow work, and this idea that, we take it upon ourselves to sort of tuck away or try to, exterminate parts of ourselves that we think are shameful or aren't, in accord with how we're supposed to be presenting ourselves amongst the, society and the people we're around. But those pieces of ourselves are always sort of there lurking, unconsciously, and affect us in oftentimes very destructive ways.
Yeah.
And it's part of the shadow work process to sort of get back in tune with those things that we sort of hide from ourselves as an audience member, and try to rediscover them, because we have the access to it as the performer. We can go backstage and we can say, no, actually, these are the things that I've been trying to hide from you, but they're here. And how can we reincorporate them into ourselves in a healthy way so that we can become effectively a more whole person again that we sort of were born with?
Yeah, I love this section too. And this is what's great about this book is this is like just one paragraph within this chapter, and it's kind of an aside, but it's such a profound idea. And even the language he uses, kind of talking about the individual as both performer and audience. Yeah, I think that's exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about repression, right?
Yeah.
We repress certain things. In Goffman's words, we repress certain information about ourselves. We kind of keep it backstage in our unconscious. And I guess in this analogy, our conscious mind would be front stage, right?
Right.
We don't want to kind of bring that certain unpleasant information or this way that we're kind of seeing ourselves, so we kind of keep it in our unconscious.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, I mean, again, writing from the 1950s, I don't really know how much Goffman was like really aware of all this stuff. I don't get the sense that he was particularly in tune with sort of Eastern thought at all, in the same way like someone like Alan Watts would have been. So it's fascinating because it's almost like he's kind of reasoning his way to the same kind of conclusions, but he can't quite make the jump. He's almost there, and he's like, wait a minute, this is too heavy, like this is too big. And we talked about the fact that he really doesn't even get into the sort of existential sense of like who we are until the very like last or second to last page of the book, because I think it's just a little bit far beyond from what he was really trying to do, which was just sort of highlight this sort of analogy about how we think about social, interactions. So
that's such a good point. I mean, it's almost, I mean, it's comical because it's like this, 250 page book.
Right.
Most of it is, him kind of laying out this framework, and it's not until the conclusion, the last 2 pages, where he's just like, oh yeah, by the way, there is no self.
Right.
And you're just like, wait, what? So like a lot of this, through Goffman's analysis has existential implications. Thank you. Yeah. Maybe we can talk about those last couple pages and dig a little deeper.
Yeah. I'll let you start because candidly, I didn't really feel like I fully understood exactly what he was trying to get at there. And maybe part of it's because, again, he just kind of hits it with you like at the very last second and doesn't really extrapolate very much. So
right. So this is my understanding of it was, he actually starts here, I'll quote. He says, "The general notion that we make a presentation of ourselves to others is hardly novel. What ought to be stressed in conclusion is that the very structure of the self can be seen in terms of how we arrange for such performance in our Anglo-American society." So I think that really captures it. It's like, it's not surprising to probably anybody listening that like we are kind of performing for others. But I think what his big takeaway is, that is all the self is a social construct. According to Goffman, there really is no kind of like fixed true self to be discovered. It is just performances. And even if he says like we break this up into like there's the performer me and then there's the character that I'm playing, he would say both performer and character are only things that can kind of be kind of created in a social context, in a social context.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to think about like what you would be if you didn't exist around other people, if you were born feral in the wilderness and didn't have access to this idea of building a persona for others. I mean, I think, there is this sense that I try to remind myself that every morning I wake up and I make the conscious choice to continue to be the person that is Jason, in the sense that how others see him, how I behave at work, the fact that I'm here and I chose to come and do this podcast rather than do something else entirely, there's nothing constricting me from doing anything otherwise. I mean, and that's the same sort of existentialist point about we have individual choice to do what we wish. If I want to go run off in the wilderness right now, I can. If I want to fly anywhere, I can, pending resources, and the same in sort of the Buddhist sense that, there's nothing tangible to point to say that I need to or have to be this person, other than there's this sense of society sort of compelling me to be. And so when you start to sort of peel away at that a little bit, you start to kind of think about like, well, is this the person I actually want to be? Did I want to wake up this morning and do this podcast today?
Yeah.
I can say I was very nervous, and now that we've gone along with it, I actually feel a lot better. But there was certainly sense of obligation there in terms of our friendship and desire to want to continue that and to be a good friend, because we've talked about doing this for a long time, and perhaps some guilt that we never really were able to get it done until now. So there's a lot there, and I think one thing I really take away from this book is the importance of taking the time to, with yourself, ideally away from technology and other distractions, to really sit down and ask yourselves, are you living the kind of existence that you want? And acknowledging that you have the ability to change any moment in time, that nothing that you qualify by yourself is fixed in stone. That you're not this person, you're not antisocial if you want to make more friends, you're not, unathletic if you want to make, go to the gym and become, a marathon runner. Like, there's the capacity for those things to happen if you actually want to make those changes. But it's very tough sometimes when we're held back by the perception of ourselves, particularly as we've designed it for other people, but then it gets extrapolated back to how we see ourselves even when we're without them. So,
yeah, no, I think it's great. I definitely try to do that in my own life, and, just as passionate about drumming as I am reading philosophy and talking about ideas. And those things are, I think in a lot of people's minds, completely inconsistent performances. But, doesn't hang me up too much. One thing, maybe we can end with this. He talks about cynical and sincere performances. It's basically one's belief in one's own performance. So he defines a sincere performance as basically where we actually sincerely believe that we are the character that we are playing in this performance. Whereas a cynical performance is one in which we, it's cynical in the sense that like we feel that we are kind of performing. We feel that we're putting on a show or kind of acting inauthentically. And there's probably a lot to be said here, but to kind of tie it into what we're talking about now, one of the things I was thinking about is, you know, we're kind of talking about this kind of dilemma that a lot of people have to kind of act consistently, not only amongst other people, but also with themselves. But he talks about how a lot of times there is this natural movement from a cynical performance to a sincere one, in that, like, you know, the first day on the job, you know, on a new job, say you're like the greeter at Barnes and Nobles or whatever, it's going to feel like you're performing. It's going to feel weird. You're going to feel awkward doing it. But after about a month on the job, it becomes sincere. It's just like, that's just like a part of who you are. You don't really think too much about it.
Yeah.
So I bring that up to kind of speculate if that's kind of the natural progression of any change, and that like it is going to kind of be clunky at first and feel like a performance, feel contrived, and then eventually become sincere.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question about that sense of not feeling sincerity, but then still continuing on with the activity. What are the motivations behind it? Is it because you truly feel passionate about the activity or the way that you want to be, and therefore you're pushing yourself past that discomfort to try to kind of fill in to the point where you can feel like natural? Or, you know, or is it that you sort of feel compelled to do so by other people and then eventually kind of forget that that was ever the case? I'm glad you brought this up, because this is the one quote that I remember when I was in college that I read, and this was nice. Like, this was it. This was like the quote that I was like, that resonate with. He says on page 19, "It is probably no mere historical accident that the word person in its first meeting is a mask. It is rather a recognition of the fact that everyone is always and everywhere, more or less consciously, playing a role. It is in these roles that we know each other. It is in these roles that we know ourselves. In a sense, and insofar as this mask represents the conception we have formed of ourselves, the role we are striving to live up to, this mask is our truer self, the self we would like to be. In the end, our conception of our role becomes second nature and an integral part of our personality. We come into the world as individuals, achieve character, and become persons." I can't remember exactly if this was the Goosebumps movie or book about the mask, where, you know, the kid has put the mask on and then like over time is starting to struggle to take it off, you know, and it's like the mask kind of grows to his face and he's sort of, you know, he can no longer kind of feel the little like lips next to his neck. Where
Jim Carrey the mask, or no? Different one?
It may have been the case also in the mask as well, but I'm thinking of a different example. You know, but I think the analogy sort of fits, which is that, yeah, you know, at any given time, it might feel like we're wearing some sort of mask or covering on our face as we're sort of stepping into a role. It feels very, you know, unlike ourselves, whatever that might mean. But then at some point over time, we forget that it ever felt that way. The question is, you know, I think getting to Goffman's sort of existential point, like, at what point did we ever really sort of put on the mask to begin with, you know? Yeah. And can we ever really truly take it off?
Yeah, I paraphrase this whole idea, fake it until you become it.
Yeah, 100%.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's kind of a mind-blowing stuff. But,
yeah, but I think in the Buddhist sense, we would say that we're always faking it, no matter how much we think that we're becoming it. Yeah, because there is no becoming it ultimately.
Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. I think that's a good place to leave off.
Yeah.
I'm glad that we finally made it happen. All of our backstage preparation, I think, paid off. Hopefully this is somewhat coherent. Granted, the listener will be hearing a slightly edited version. I don't
ever so slightly. Might be some special effects thrown in, maybe some auto-tuning going on, you know?
Yeah. So, auto-tuning. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks, Jason.
Of course. I appreciate you having me. Looking forward to coming on in 2 years from now again.
Cool. Hey, this is Zach. Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, be sure to follow it so that you get notified every time I release an episode. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, I'd really appreciate if you could take a few seconds to rate the show. This really helps with the algorithm so that more people can discover it. Also, if you would like to get in touch with me or to hear about what's coming up next on the podcast, visit unpackingideas.com/podcast. And there I post links to books and essays that we'll be discussing on future podcast episodes. All right, that's going to do it for today. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next episode.